Good noon, everyone. Welcome to the fourth day of our 5-day webinar series for National Crime Victims' Rights Week. And we're coming to you live from Homeland Security Investigations. And we want to thank them. They've been a terrific host for us, most gracious. We really appreciate them hosting us. Today, I'm going to be presenting, and we're actually going to get to know a little bit more about the host agency for this webinar, which is CY Christ. But before we get started, I'm going to have Tricia go ahead and share the screen. And I just want to remind people that this Saturday, starting at 10 a.m. your local time, it's April 30th, it's going to be National Drug Take Back Day, hosted by DEA. You can go to their website, dea.gov, and find information where you can go to take old prescriptions that you might have at your house. You don't want to leave those at home. Children can get into them. Take them back to these take-back locations. You can just drop them off. They will take it back for you. All right. So I want to introduce CY Christ to you and tell you a little bit about our organization. Go ahead, Tricia. Officially, we started in 2020, but we really began in 2018. We started in response to a case of faith-based abuse within my own church. And I really wanted to do something to not only make my own church realize the implications of faith-based abuse, but help churches everywhere, realizing that this is an important topic. We also wanted to help the victims come to healing and be able to thrive. And so we started this organization, and we have 4 members. We're run by a board of directors, and we're always looking for more people. And we primarily focus on cases with a faith-based nexus. So that would include church members who may have been abused. And those are our main focuses, but we will serve anyone. And we've partnered with Homeland Security for helping victims of human trafficking. And we're doing a multitude of other things that have nothing to do with faith-based abuse. We just are really dedicated to wanting to help people. I just want to tell you a little bit more. CY Christ is obviously an acronym. It's a very long acronym. It stands for Christian Youth Combating Harassment, Rape, Incest, Slavery, and Intimate Terrorism. And our mission is, as a group of young people, we want to raise awareness of faith-based abuse among all denominations, motivate members and victims to report all instances of misconduct without the fear of retaliation. We want to provide survivors with the resources to recover and feel safe, fully attend to members' and victims' needs, and properly report misconduct. And we strive to seek justice and help eliminate the possibility of abuse in the Christian church. And we have a vision that we hope to create a faith-based environment free of sexual misconduct and all other forms of abuse in the Christian faith, and bring restoration to the lives of those impacted with hope and healing through the power of God. We're obviously a faith-based organization. And you can see some of the services that we provide. We do victim services. We're working on starting a response team. That can travel anywhere in the country to specifically help victims who are affected by faith-based abuse. We do training. We've done training with churches. One of them was in El Paso, and we helped them to learn about how human trafficking affects the Christian church. And we also do assessments. We can tell you what you can do to do better with your reporting and your policies to make your churches safe. We also do consultation. We can provide some expertise to investigating agencies about some of the nuances with faith-based abuse. There are quite a few things that need to be thought about. I'm also a forensic interviewer, so we can conduct forensic interviews. And then another thing that we do, and what we're mainly going to be talking about and focusing on today, is research. We have a case tracking center, and essentially we track criminal and civil cases with a faith-based nexus. And we gather and we track cases that are in the federal system. This has been the easiest way because it's a unified system. We are able to leverage the resources that the Department of Justice, FBI, and the Department of Homeland Security Investigations has to follow cases all the way from when the individuals are charged and indicted to sentencing. And we use those statistics, that information, to author reports, build statistics, and kind of look at what's happening. So our research center, we conduct research, we oversee and manage grants once we start getting grants. And the information that we gather, we use in our research, it goes to develop our trainings, our workshops that we put together. And we offer that to churches, faith communities, or any individuals or organizations who are interested in learning so that we can better work with victims to make reforms in churches and eliminate the possibility of abuse. And we hope that the research provided by the Research Center will help everyone with making their faith community a safe place for members and be the repository of the riches of grace, which is what faith communities really are supposed to be. They're supposed to be helping their communities at large. So the main thing that we're talking about today is our faith-based abuse report in 2020. It's a 54-page report. Don't worry, we're not going to go through the whole thing and read every page. But we examine 13 federal cases with a faith-based nexus. And in the report, we divide it into 3 sections, 3 major categories of cases. And then each section includes 2 case studies that we felt would highlight some of the things that we see in faith-based abuse. So the method that we used, we gathered cases from federal records. This includes indictments and court records, public information. And we use that to gather offender demographics, and also some victim demographics can be gathered from there too. And so we compiled statistics, and that's what we're going to look at. So we do want to offer a disclaimer that all offenders are presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt in the court of law. We're not going to mention any specific offenders, so that should be fine, and I won't read this whole thing, but essentially what we want to say is we're limited only right now to the cases that go into the federal system, because we can easily track those cases. And there are only 13 cases in the year 2020. And we don't believe that's a representative sample. So we cannot make any generalizations or predictions or summaries on this. It only presents what we know from 2020 in the federal system. And we hope we can gather more information and get more statistics. Hopefully we can get a more representative sample size and be able to tell you maybe trends from year to year, but we will not be talking about trends, whether it's up this year or down 1 year. We just want to present the facts to you as we get them. And last, before we jump into the report, is we want to thank the Department of Justice, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, specifically Homeland Security Investigations, for providing the information that made this report possible. And this report was compiled with information in court documents that includes public records and other information that was released by these agencies. So let's jump in. The first section that we're going to talk about is financial abuse. So we look at offenders first. Churches can be offenders, church organizations, church leaders can be the offenders, or even members. They can use their position, whether they're a leader in the church, like a pastor, or just a member. They use that to extort or to financially defraud other members of money. So let's look at the victims. Victims can be church organizations too, and they can be church members or even non-church members. This type of fraud is known as affinity fraud, where someone you think you should be able to trust because of their affiliation, because they're in the community, you give them money because you take their word for what they're going to use that money for. But instead they use it to gratify themselves. So we're going to take a look at some of the faith-based financial crimes in 2020. We won't go through all of them. There were, I believe, only 4 cases of faith-based crimes with the financial section, but these crimes had multiple counts attached to them. You can look at some of them there. We mainly divide these crimes into 3 categories for the ease of the report. and they are fraud, embezzlement, and laundering. We'll look into each one of those briefly. So, fraud is knowing and the intended deception of a person, church, ministry, or organization, group, or congregation to gain their monies and use them for personal gain or other purposes not related or known by those who gave the money. So, an example of this could be an elder asking for donations to fund a mission trip, but that elder instead uses it on a personal vacation. That is fraud. Then embezzlement, it involves taking an organization, church, ministry, or group's money by someone who had permission to access that money. They were entrusted to access that money, to use it to pay the bills and cover expenses, but they instead used it to pad their own bank accounts. So an example would be a priest or a treasurer who had access to their church's bank account to make deposits, to make payments, but they instead transfer or withdraw money and put it in their own bank account for personal use. And I believe this is probably the most prevalent case that we've seen is priests or treasurers who have access to money to the church's bank account. They will take some out, siphon little bits at a time, and put it in their own account. We'll look into that in a little more detail later. So laundering, there was I believe only one case of laundering in 2020, but it involves persons who conduct or they attempt to conduct financial transactions, knowing that the property involved in the financial transaction, it represents the proceeds of some unlawful activity. So an example might be an elder who stole money and then used it to conduct business, and that's, in this case, what that was. All right, let's look at the offenders. So we had 7 offenders in these 4 cases, and you can see their age. The age at time of first offense, something that's important to note, all of these abuses typically went over the course of several years, some of them even decades. And they went unnoticed, unreported, or maybe ignored. So you can see the differences between the age of the offenders at the time of the first offense, and then at the time they were arrested or indicted, and then the number of years that the scheme lasted. The youngest offender was 37. The oldest was 49 at the time of the offense. And then you can see the median age there. Next, we're going to look at positions to kind of see what the scope is, how these offenders were related to the organizations or the victims that they defrauded. So one of them was the director of a religious organization. They were charged with wire fraud, tax fraud. That's another thing that we see is tax fraud is pretty common among faith-based abuse. They don't pay taxes or they withhold taxes, and that's one way that the federal government is able to put a stop to their illegal activity, because typically they're not going to file taxes on money that they stole from the church. And then one of the other cases, an offender started their own purported ministry. They were the president of that organization, but they were stealing money from that, and that was the case that involved the money laundering. And then in another case, there was no known affiliation. There were multiple offenders in this case, and they had no positions in the church. This is a case of strangers trying to illegally access a church's account. We'll look into that in greater detail. And another one was the director, administrator, priest, or pastor of Catholic churches or parishes. Because the abuse spanned over several years, many of these offenders held several positions over that period of time. Next, we're going to look at the victim or the victims, and we have 2 categories of victims when it comes to financial abuse. Although with faith-based abuse, there are always at least 2 categories of victims. There's the person who is mainly affected by the abuse, directly affected, and then there's a congregation. The congregation as a whole can be affected. But in financial abuse, groups are more prevalent to be victimized. So there were at least 25 victims, and they were both individual. Those victims were individuals. With groups, there was at least one group that, or two groups, excuse me, that we know of. And then these are the known victims and their relation to the offender. So one was an organization, the offender was an employee, that was the employee, excuse me. And then there were also parishes that were involved, and they were the congregation of the offender. And then with two churches, these are the groups. The two churches, the offenders were strangers trying to access their funds. And then there were a total of 20 individuals who were affected, who had their money stolen, or who gave money to the offender thinking it was going to be used for a mission trip, and it was not. And now we can go over the amount stolen. This is kind of an important factor because you can base this report is meant to be informative, but you can also look at it and use it to take action on what you can do to prevent abuses. And with financial abuses, it's more easy. The lowest amount that was stolen in any given time was $2,000, just over $2,000, and then the highest amount was $200,000. And so the average of all of the money stolen was about $45,000, and then the total was nearly $2 million stolen from churches and individuals. And this figure depicts the amount stolen by occasion. As I said, the abuses took place over several years, and in no case was the offender taking it all at once. They spread it out over the course of several weeks, several years, so that they would go unnoticed. So in case one, you could see the amounts, how much was stolen, and all the way through to case 4. They were taking different amounts so that it would go unnoticed by others looking at it. Now we're going to look at a case study. And there are two types of cases when it comes to financial abuse. One is strangers, and then the other one is known individuals. This case highlights a stranger. So starting in November of 2017 and continuing up or until July 2018, one offender and an unspecified number of co-conspirators, they conspired to steal money from two churches' bank accounts. They targeted a pension fund that was used for services and for members, and that included ministers. So these offenders and the co-conspirators, they fraudulently obtained the names and personal identifying information of the church members responsible for the accounts. Armed with the names of the personal identifying information of the account holders, the offenders then impersonated those individuals and would make withdrawals and money transfers from those accounts. The offenders attempted to obtain $400,000 from both of those churches' bank accounts. And so this case represents strangers trying to steal money for their own gratification, and it's strangers, not from individuals in the churches. There is a greater number of cases where the individual is known, typically the leader of the church or someone with a position of authority in the church. That was the only case that I actually know of so far where strangers have targeted the offender's money. So case study number 2, this offender is one who held multiple positions in the Russian Orthodox or Catholic Church. And they ranged from pastor, administrator, and priest of 2 parishes, and the director of a shrine. The offender had access to the bank accounts of the 3 institutions that he was running, and beginning in May of 2014 and until July 2018, the offender began embezzling monies from these institutions. The eparchy, or the organization that oversees the parishes, they had established guidelines for priests and administrators that detailed the expenses that the parish would pay for priests and guidelines for reimbursements. But despite these guidelines, the offender used institution funds for prohibited personal expenses. And between May of 2014 to June of 2015, the offender embezzled approximately $35,000. Some of this money he used for items such as department store shopping, automotive, grocery payments. And then from January 2015 to July 2018, the offender allegedly embezzled an additional $70,000. And this money he spent on things like car dealers, contractors, grocery department and outlet stores, and online music services. And then again, the offender allegedly embezzled $187,000 from January of 2015 to July of 2018. And he was doing this while pastoring another church. This money he used on other personal expenses such as firearms and ammunition, car dealers, and online shopping. So that was the other case. They both highlight the different ends of the spectrum, one being a stranger targeting the money from the church, and then the other case was a priest. In the second case, the priest was terminated from his positions, but he continued to use a debit card of one of his churches and spent an additional $2,000. In total, that offender stole nearly $300,000 from all three bank accounts. And at least one of those churches or parishes had to close down, and they are suffering from it. So the effects of financial abuse are long-ranging. They're money that churches are supposed to use to help the community, to help members, are easily targeted by officials in the church to be used for their own personal expenses. So we want to urge churches and ministries to guard their funds securely. We're going to move on to the second section now, sexual abuse. This is the most known type of faith-based abuse. It's largely because of the Catholic Church's sexual abuse scandal, but it's important to note that many other churches suffer from this problem. It's not limited to just the Catholic Church. We've seen Seventh-day Adventist Church be affected. We've seen the Southern Baptist Church be affected, and a host of non-denominational and smaller churches are affected. So sexual abuse is any type of sexual act or threat of a sexual act against a member of the church, person being ministered to by a church member or minister, or another type of sexual offense with a faith-based nexus. In this section, there were only 2 cases in 2020. Again, remember that we can only look at federal crimes, and federal crimes when it comes to sexual crimes are very specific. It has to cross state lines, has to be done on government property or the special maritime or territorial jurisdiction of the United States, or has some online component to it, some interstate component to it. So we also, for ease of dividing cases, we put them in categories and subcategories. The first is hands-on sexual abuse. This is where the offender actually abuses the victim. And then the other category is pornography, and this has 2 subcategories. The first one is elicited. So the offender elicits the victim to send them pornographic images. And then the second is possession. The offender doesn't take an active role in getting someone to send them pornography. What that's called is producing pornography. The offender doesn't have a role in that. They get it from someone else. They get it online, in the dark net, or another pedophile that they know. These are typically what we've seen. These are typically pedophiles who commit this crime, or at least the crimes that we see in the federal system. So in 2020, these are some of the crimes that were charged. 3 counts of transporting a minor across state lines. So that was the interstate nexus and how the federal government was able to get involved and charge these cases. And 1 was coercing a minor to cross state lines. And then the third was receipt of child pornography. That means receiving child pornography. And these are the differential ages of the offenders. And again, these cases spanned several years. One of them was over 40 years long that the abuse had taken place. And the offender of that case was 25 at the time of the first offense and 65 at the when he was finally arrested. And then the other case, the offender was a similar age, 26, during the first offense, and the abuse lasted for 23 years. And the median age of these offenders was 57.5. And then the positions of these offenders, both were pastors. One was a Roman Catholic priest employed at a number of Catholic churches, parishes, and schools in the diocese in New York. The other was a youth pastor, and they were employed during the scheme or during the abuse at two separate churches, one in Texas and one in Arkansas. So we're going to go into victims and victimology. We have a little more information on the victim statistics in these cases, but given the nature of the crime, there's not a lot of information to include. But we can tell you that there were a total of 4 victims, and they were between 1997 and 2020, and the median age of these victims was 15. In this next slide, you can see the victims. 2 were female, 1 was male, and 1 victim, the gender was not specified, and neither was their age. But you can also see what their age was at the time the abuse started. 1 was 14, 1 was 16, and 1 was 15. All right, we're going to go into a case study on sexual abuse. So in this case, the offender, they were the youth pastor for the churches in Arkansas and Texas. And what they did was they took their youth group on camping trips, and this offender would engage what is known as grooming. In 1992, he began this process, and on a 14-year-old girl in this youth group. This included making frequent inappropriate comments to her, and he also told her that he loved her. And then in May of 1997, when the girl was now 15 years old, the offender led an 8th grade camping trip to Arkansas. And during that trip, the offender was able to isolate the girl and sexually assaulted her. He told her not to tell anyone. And then in 2002, the offender was pastoring a different church, and he began grooming a 16-year-old girl and had inappropriate sexual contact with her. And on multiple occasions between 2002 and 2003, he continued this abuse. And then the summer of 2003, the youth group attended an event in Florida, and there the offender was able to isolate the victim by asking her to ride on a charter bus with him instead of the bus that the rest of her friends and the rest of the youth group were on. And on this bus ride, the offender sexually assaulted her. And this case, although it misses a great amount of detail, it includes the abuse of a third minor, and it demonstrates some of the techniques used to abuse minors, known as grooming. And the offender used a variety of methods. They may have started off as harmless comments or remarks, but they escalated to inappropriate sexual comments. And by telling the first victim that he loved her, he was hoping that she would truly believe that and would be less likely to resist and less likely to report the misconduct. And the grooming went on for about a year until the offender had an opportunity to isolate the victim on a camping trip and then assault her. And then the same isolation tactic was used with the second victim to get her alone and sexually assault her. And it is highly likely that similar grooming tactics was used on this victim also, but those details are not currently available. But both of those individuals, or the victims, they represent a pattern of predatory behavior. The second case study, it highlights the pornography category of cases, and this one was elicited. So in the summer of 2019, a 15-year-old male was on Grindr, and uploaded sexually explicit photos. He was contacted by the offender on the app, and this offender turned out to be a Roman Catholic priest. So that priest, he was a pastor of an institution in the city of New York, and he began communicating over text to the victim, and the offender made sexually aggressive and suggestive remarks, sent sexually explicit photos to the victim, and advised the victim on ways to conceal their relationship and communication. They texted about meeting up, and the offender mentioned the specific acts that he was hoping to do to the victim. And when federal agents went to interview the offender, he admitted being the one who sent the photos of himself to the victim. He admitted believing he was speaking to a 15-year-old boy. And furthermore, he also said that he met with a different 15-year-old boy and had sexual relations at the victim's high school. The offender also stated that he attempted to meet with minors for sexual encounters on numerous occasions. And the FBI has asked for public's assistance with identifying other potential cases or other potential victims of this offender. And they released a list of the offender's assignments since 1980. If you go to our website, survivorchrist.org, and look at the Case Tracking Center, you can actually see the information that was posted. We have it there for you also. All right, the last section of the report talks about trafficking in persons. And someone asked earlier in the week when we had the roundtable on Monday if trafficking happens in religious settings. And it absolutely does. It does happen in churches. And we've seen it two different ways. One, the entire church organization can be complicit in it, or individuals can be in the organization, can be orchestrating it. So in 2020, there were a total of 2 cases of trafficking. There were 4 offenders, and there were 84 known victims. And this section, it has probably the largest list of crimes that were committed, and many of these, in the indictment, many of those crimes did not list how many counts were served against them or that they were charged with. They range from sexual trafficking of a minor to visa and immigration fraud and marriage fraud. And we'll get into the details of those cases in a little bit. But we'll talk about the offenders first. So there were 4 offenders. 3 acted together as part of a scheme. 1 was an individual, and then there was also 1 church organization that directly was involved in trafficking. Of the offenders, there are actually 3 female offenders and 1 male offender. All the other offenders up to this point have been males. And here you can see also the differential ages of the offenders. Again, the number of years that the scheme lasted was generally over 20 years. And so the youngest offender at the time of the offense was 21, and then the oldest was 39. At the time of the arrest or indictment, the oldest was 59, and the youngest was 41. And the mean age of the offenders at the time of their arrest was 50.5. In this slide, you can see the organization's affiliation and position of offenders. So, as I previously said, 3 of them were church leaders. They held high-level leadership positions. So one of them was the leader for the U.S. branch of a church. The church is Philippine-based, and one of the offenders was the leader for the United States branch of it. And then the second offender didn't really have a specific title, but what they did was basically act as the human resource director. And then the third one was basically the treasurer of the church branch in the United States. And then the last offender, they were the priest and pastor of a Catholic parish and school. And we actually have a little more information on victims in this case, such as ethnicity. So the large majority of the victims in this case were Asian. There was at least, I believe there were 75 Filipinos, and then at least one American, or excuse me, one Ukrainian. This is based on passport information that was obtained and confiscated during a raid on the church, and we'll get into that case in a little bit. And then the identity or the ethnicity is unknown. And then this area for ages of the victims is largely unknown. There are only 2 victims that the age is known. The first one was a male, and they were age 12 at the time the abuse first began. And at the time that the abuse ended, that the offender was arrested, there were 32, so that was in 2020. And then the second victim, the abuse started in 2000. It was also a male, and he was 6 years old at the time the abuse first started, and was 26 in 2020 when the offender was arrested. And then victims 3 through 82, the rest of those victims, their age is unknown and their gender is unknown, but the large majority of those ones are known to be Filipinos and one Ukrainian, so a Caucasian. So we're going to go into the case study for this area. So the first case, it represents organizational trafficking. Like I said, there are 2 types of cases. Organizations can be complicit and even directing trafficking, and then individuals can do it. So the first case study, it shows this. So 3 administrators of a church based in the Philippines orchestrated an immigration, marriage, financial fraud, and labor trafficking scheme for over 20 years. The administrators, we're going to refer to them as offenders, they obtained visas for church members to enter the United States as full-time workers. And they also were able to get them on student visas with schools that had lenient attendant policies, or they were able to bring in individuals based on fraudulent marriages, and they conducted those with church officials. So the church brought these members into the U.S., and they referred to them as miracle workers, and their job was to raise money for a sham charity that allegedly helped impoverished children in the Philippines. Now, the reality is that little to none of the approximately $20 million that was raised between 2014 and 2019 was used to help children in the Philippines. It instead went to finance the lavish lifestyle of these offenders and other church members. Most of this money was made from street-level solicitation. You heard on Monday, Special Agent Langer talked about how that's the most common, most popular means that churches use. If they do trafficking, they use street-level solicitation. And that's how this church also directed their victims. They also would raise money by performing at musical events. And that's how they were told they were going to raise money when they initially came to the United States, when they were initially offered to come to the United States, that they would be raising money to help the organization, to help the nonprofit, to help the church. But once they arrived in the United States, they were required to turn over all their passports to the administrators of the church. And then the administrators began sending them across the United States. They worked long hours at street-level solicitation in order to reach daily quotas. They received little to no pay for their efforts, and from information in court documents, some of these victims may have also smuggled money back to the Philippines. And that was used to fund the church leader, the head of the church. They've since been indicted, but that was this year, actually, 2022, that the leader of the whole church organization has been indicted. But some victims, they knew that they were coming to the U.S. to raise money, but some were unaware of the actual purpose for coming to the U.S. until they were forced to solicit on the streets nearly every day of the year. And victims reported working long hours, often sleeping in cars, and not having access to over-the-counter medicine or even clothes. To keep victims in the US, the offenders falsified immigration documents or arranged sham marriages. These marriages were arranged between the victims and other church workers or members who were US citizens. The offenders, they possessed ATM cards to show immigration officials that the victims and members had shared bank accounts, just to bolster the lie that these were actual marriages, make it look like they were actual marriages. But two offenders, they had wedding rings readily available to perform these fraudulent marriage ceremonies. Federal agents, they uncovered the scheme. This was a joint case between Homeland Security Investigations and the FBI and multiple other agencies. They executed several search warrants on church properties in California and Hawaii. And at one of the compounds in California, agents found nearly 100 passports from Philippines, from Ukraine, from the United States. And immigration records indicate that over the past 20 years, there have been at least 82 fraudulent marriages between victims and church employees or members. The agents also discovered a file that was titled Traitor in the possession of one of the defendants. And this file contained information on members who had fled the church. Other court records, one of them being a request to detain individuals before trial, they indicate that the workers were mentally and even physically abused, beaten with paddles, isolated, and forced to fast. Victims also report being punished for leaving the church and for having relationships with non-church members, and also for making negative statements about the church or about the leadership. And female victims were pressured to have sex with the senior leader, and they referred to that as night duty. Several victims reported severe abuse. One said that they were sent to the upper sixth, which was the name of a chamber at the compound, where they were isolated and were forced to fast and listen to recorded sermons for at least 3 days. Still another victim reported an incident where they had their head shaved and were forced to wear an orange shirt that said SOS on the back, and that stood for Son of Satan. These victims also reported being hit on the back of the head with a paddle over 100 times their first day in isolation. The first case represents the most severe form of trafficking, and victims, they were not just coerced by threats or fraud, but they were physically abused, which is not very often that you see in human trafficking cases. But in this case, it's one of the most severe cases that I've seen so far. But it's not the only one. I know of at least 2 other cases where church organizations have done very similar things and made their church members, the people that they were supposedly trying to help, solicit money and fund the leaders' personal lives instead of the church. And the religious overtones in this case, it represents not only spiritual abuse, but physical and mental abuse also. And this is still an active case, and federal agencies that are involved, they're continuing to encourage potential victims to come forward. And be sure to check out our website. We'll have information there who you can contact. The principal agency is the FBI in Los Angeles, and we will give contact information for them. The second case study is actually a more unique look at trafficking. In the statute for adults, you have to prove force, fraud, or coercion, and also trafficking is any funds or anything that was perceived as having value traded for sexual contact. And I've seen cases where they've used this where minors have been given alcohol for sex. They've been able to charge that as sexual trafficking. So this case, it fits more along the lines of sexual abuse, but the federal government was able to charge this as a trafficking case because of the actions that the offender took. This began in 2000 when the victim was in Catholic school. He met the offender while the offender was in seminary. And from that point on, the offender engaged in the process that we already talked about. It's known as grooming. The offender took advantage of the victim, and they came from a very troubled background. So they became a father figure to the victim, regularly coming over to the victim's house, gave the victim money, showed affection for the victim, and began to inappropriately touch the victim and make sexual comments. After the offender graduated from the seminary, he became a priest and transferred to a nearby parish, but continued to visit the victim. There are actually two victims in this case. We're going to refer to the first one as victim number one. So he began to visit victim number one, but it escalated to rape. Victim one had become addicted to opiates as a teen after an injury. And as a result of the inappropriate touching by the offender, it has a severe psychological impact, sexual abuse. So the offender took advantage of victim one's addiction and enticed him with money to come to his residence and continue the abuse. Victim one did not want to be abused, but they could not go through the effects of withdrawal, so the abuse continued. And when victim one was in his 20s, the offender made what was called, or what was referred to in the indictment as a confession video or an action video, where the offender confessed to raping victim one and described his grooming process and some of the inappropriate touching. The offender also made another video of him sexually abusing victim one. And within the last year of the offender being indicted, victim one reported that he had gone to the offender's house and was abused at least 6 or 7 times. The offender sent the videos to victim one and then taunted him with them, saying that if victim one took the videos to the police, that he would never be able to give victim one money, that everyone would know who victim one was, and that the parish would be ruined. The offender communicated with victim one via text and would make sexual remarks about victim one and guilt victim one. And then the second victim also began in 2000. The second victim was in grade school. The offender, he began to come over to victim's house, would spend time with victim's 2 older brothers, and it was when the victim was in 8th grade that the offender began to make inappropriate comments. And victim 2 began using opioids also and became addicted. When the second victim was in the 9th grade and was homesick from school, as what he described as being dope sick, the offender came over to his house, and victim 2 was the only one home at the time that the offender came. And the offender paid money to the victim to have him perform sexual acts. The victim reported that he did not want to do it, but knowing that he could use the money to get opiates and relieve the pain that he was in, he acquiesced to the offender's request. The offender continued to make sexual comments to victim 2 that would shame him into keeping silent. He also told victim 2 that he could tell no one about the abuse or about the offender because he would get in a lot of trouble. The abuse continued with victim 2 for several years, with the offender making disparaging comments and telling victim 2 of the trouble that he would be in if he told anyone what the offender was doing. Victim 2 told agents that he was scared to report the abuse because he felt like no one would believe him. A young, troubled drug addict, whether as a minor or as an adult, over the offender, who was a respected Catholic priest. And during the investigation and in court documents, the offender's parish also had a preschool and kindergarten to 8th grade school associated with it. This case study demonstrates the kind of trafficking that is more common but less thought about by the public. In the statute, once again, trafficking can occur by force, fraud, or coercion. It is incredibly common for traffickers to use drugs to exploit a victim's addiction to traffic them. And this meets the definition of coercion. And it's been used to make many human trafficking cases. And you can read the full report on our website and see we have probably about 30 references that you can look at where from these cases and where cases have been used, where drug abuse was used and exploited to exploit a victim. And this case study also shows the offender's grooming method, and it started with getting to know the family, the intended victim, and over time, lowering the victim's inhibitions, making sexual comments and inappropriate touching. And then the offender also identified a problem that he could exploit in his victims, the abuse and the addiction to opiates. The offender used that to gain access to the victims and then to abuse them and also to keep them from reporting it. The offender also engaged in communications and other methods that he used to shame the victims, keep them quiet, and continued to exploit them far into their adulthood. These victims, the first one was 12 years old when the abuse began. The second was 6 years old when the grooming process started. And the abuse spanned for decades. The offender gave cash to the victims after the sexual abuse, and that's what enabled this to be a human trafficking case. So we're just going to go over 2020 in summary. There were a total of 8 cases in federal court that had a faith-based nexus. 4 of those cases were under the category of financial abuse. 2 of those cases were sexual abuse, and 2 of those cases were trafficking. And then all of the abuse in 2020, they lasted for multiple years. The shortest scheme lasted 2 years and was a financial abuse scheme. The longest offender's abuse may have lasted as long as 40 years, and this was sexual abuse. The average number of years that the scheme or the abuse lasted was 15.6 years. Looking at the offenders, there were 9 offenders, 69.23 committed financial abuse. 2 offenders, or 15% committed sexual abuse, and 4 offenders, they committed trafficking crimes. There were 3 female offenders. Excuse me, I'll have to fix that. But there were also 10 male offenders. The youngest age at the start was 21, and the oldest was 49. This was at the start of the abuse, and that made the median age 35. And then you can also read the offenders at the time of their arrest, how old they were. Because of how long the abuse lasted, they were older. The median age of offenders arrested was 53. And looking at the victims, there were a total of 107 known victims. And in this financial abuse, there were 5 group victims, 4 groups, and then 1. And there were 5 groups, which were churches. Then there were also 20 other individuals who were victims. And for most victims, demographic information was unavailable, but we do know that 3 victims were male and 2 were females. The youngest victim was 6 years old when the abuse began, and the oldest was 16. This is when the abuse began. And then the abuse for 2 of them spanned largely into their adulthood. And then looking more on victim information, the ethnicity was based on passport information available on 73 of the victims. 72 of them are Filipinos, and 1 is a Caucasian. And then the remaining 34 victims, the ethnicity was unknown. And then we are working on the report for 2021. We're actually expanding it to include hate crimes against churches and faith-based communities. So we hope to have that ready and done by August of this year. And then we also want to appeal to you for help. If you have information on cases, you can send it to these 2 emails. Include as much information as you can on the 2 cases. We want to expand from just looking at the federal system to going more in depth, looking for cases everywhere that we can, so that we can get as large a sample size as possible. All right, now we can take questions if there are any. Very good. Trisha's going to look at that. I want to again thank Homeland Security Investigations for being gracious hosts and helping us. And Trisha has been here every day of the webinar to help us out. And then we've had other help also. Here, all right. Well then, Thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate you coming and attending the webinar. If you missed some of the days, we had them on YouTube and also on Facebook. You can go back and watch them. Tomorrow is the last day, and you're going to hear more about human trafficking by a special agent with Homeland Security Investigations. So be sure to tune in tomorrow at 12 p.m. Mountain Time. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a nice day. We'll see you tomorrow. All right, we're off.
We're quietly clapping.
Thanks.